Welcome to Nourishing the Mother, an inspired conversation space between Bridget Wood and Julie Tenner on the journey of motherhood through the common thread of parenting, relationship, and sexuality as a path to consciousness.
We keep our conversations honest, our experiences real, and our philosophies exploratory. We believe that in order to raise incredible humans, we first have to raise ourselves. We know that in order to rock the family, you've got to nourish the mother. If you are here, you care about paving a path of conscious and intentional motherhood, connected with yourself and your gifts, and also illuminating your children in theirs so we may raise more whole humans who can impact this world in a more humane way.
If you desire to integrate your learnings practically and supportively, head on over to bridgetwood.life or julietenner.love to go deeper. And for all live-streamed pre-release podcasts and all our free content, head over to our free Facebook group, Nourishing the Mother with Bridget Wood and Julie Tenner. We are Julie Tenner and Bridget Wood, and we are so grateful you're here.
Hello and welcome to Nourishing the Mother. I'm Bridget Wood.
And I'm Julie Tenner. And today we are using story as a parenting tool. And we are guided on this conversation and insightfully inspired by a woman who has lit our own inner storytelling, and that is Gill Howarth from Born Wise. So she'll be joining us today for this incredible conversation that we hope is deeply powerful and impactful and adds to your parenting skill set and tool belt.
Gill Howarth is an educational changemaker, researcher, storyteller, and mother to 3 bright, beautiful, and wild boys. An early childhood educator with over 20 years of experience, Gill weaves her passions in story, creativity, and yoga into her educational philosophy via programs, consults, and courses via Born Wise. Honouring relationships and well-being, Gill practices a philosophy of conscious education. Welcome, Gill.
Hi.
So great to have you here. We have had you on the podcast before, back in pandemic 2020, when we were talking all things, I think it might have been homeschooling.
Yeah, it was make lemonade.
Make lemonade. Yeah.
Yeah.
Seeing you and your beautifully inspiring life and educational philosophy was so, I think, a time for us here in Melbourne, you know, the lockdown capital of the world. It was so energizing, I think, to just speak to you and be led by you at that time. So thank you again.
Thank you. It seems like a long time ago, actually.
It does, doesn't it?
Not that long.
And I reached out to you this time because I was reading some stories with my 5-year-old, and I noticed that she wanted to keep reading the same kinds of fables over and over again. And I thought, I know there's meaning in this for her. And I thought, we should do a podcast on this. I'll reach out to Gill. And in fact, you and I had a back and forth, and I talked about what I knew Einstein had kind of said around fairy tales, and so many of people throughout history have talked about the power of them. And I thought, I know who needs to have this conversation with us, and it's you, Gill. So thank you for coming on.
Oh, I'm so happy. It's my favorite thing, I think. Storytelling and education, they're my 2 conversational points that, I can't really stop talking about them. So I really appreciate, being on the show and being able to talk about it.
I'd love to read this passage from a book. It's called Breaking the Magic Spell, Radical Theories of Folk and Fairy Tales. I don't know if you know it, but the author says, once upon a time, the famous physicist Albert Einstein was confronted by an overly concerned woman who sought advice on how to raise her small son to become a successful scientist. In particular, she wanted to know what kinds of books she should read her son. Fairy tales, Einstein responded without hesitation. Fine, but what else should I read to him after that? The mother asked. More fairy tales, Einstein stated. And after that? Even more fairy tales, replied the great scientist, and he waved his pipe like a wizard pronouncing a happy end to a long adventure.
A really cool passage.
I love it. And so I guess I would love you probably that's a beautiful segue into why. Like, why would we hear some of the greatest minds of our time say that?
Yeah, I've heard that little anecdote before, and it's one that I think I always kind of just keep like filed away in the back of my head, because it's even though I've been working with story for a while now, in relation to education, it can still seem like not much, so it's like reminding myself all the time that yes, there is value in it, because some of the beautiful aspects of storytelling is the magic and the healing and the learning and the growth is invisible. As teachers, we recognize that that's valuable, but it can be hard to measure. It's hard to put that on a checklist. And I think there's so many things Einstein could have been talking about, in relation to it, because the deeper you kind of dig into storytelling, you just keep uncovering more and more goodness. And it's something that is probably highly, I guess, I'm going to say disregarded just because I can't think of a better word, but it's not something that's utilized. That might be a better way of putting it. But I think probably one of the main areas that maybe Einstein, and this is obviously just assuming, but would have been talking about was that imagination and creativity, because really nothing that exists now existed until someone imagined it, so imagination comes before the reality. And that's just a truth, like that can seem like something that's a little bit airy-fairy, but before there was a boat, somebody had to imagine a boat and imagine the aspect of it. And obviously these things get more complex over time, but especially if that woman was wanting to ask about how do I encourage my son to be a scientist and creator and inventor, like that imagination aspect is so, so very important. But it's often a part that we kind of skip over, I think. And fairy tales and storytelling is literally, they happen in the world of the imagination, I think books are still great and very important for kids, but they kind of work on different things. That there's a little bit of the imagination's going, but I think it's more about when you're reading a book, it's more about the literacy learning and recognizing that words carry meaning and that communication's important. That's important in itself. But when you're telling a story, the child or the adult has to visualize everything. Everything's happening in the inner landscape, which is kind of the opposite of what maybe the rest of our education system is like, because most of the time we're kind of loading the facts in there, or we're loading the ideas or the numbers or whatever it is. But if you add this element of story to anything, whether it's mathematics or science, anything, it really allows, I guess, for those things to land in the inner world. And for me, that's very much about relationship then, right? Like it's how we build a relationship and a connection with something. Yeah.
There've been storytelling and these older kind of fables, and I even think about, some of the Grimm's tales. The value is also seen as a way to transfer moral development and moral, kind of children learning about cause and effect, or different characters and their own psyche and where their psyche lands in terms of perceiving the different characters. How do you view that aspect of fairy tales?
I love it. And I mean, I think it's like anything we're probably going to end up talking about here, it's going to have a flip side to it, and it's something that can become so complex. I'm often thinking about it because I do actually also feel quite strongly against when we tell a story to a child purely for a moral
moral lesson.
Yeah, I really don't like that when you can get little books that you can tell they've been purely made to, I don't know, they want to put some sort of idea in the child and that's it. So it's not about the story, it's about the moral. Whereas if the fairy tale delivers probably many, many, many morals in one story, if that is allowed to kind of come through to the child in a very individual but also intuitive way, I think that's different. Does that make sense, what I'm
It's
saying?
almost like a whole child philosophy of like, not just we'll impart what we paternalistically think you need to know, versus how do we help the unfolding of this whole person and all parts of them.
100%.
The story, not the sake of our agenda.
Yeah. Those little shifts are really, I feel like they're really important. So there is a beauty in all of these, in the fairy tales, in the old fairy tales, and, you know, keep sort of bearing in mind that they weren't really written for children, you know, they were written for adults, and it's just like they've become part of I think it would have been around the Grimm's time, maybe just after that they did start becoming children's stories, you know. And what's really interesting about fairy tales, I know people, it's tricky. Some people I've read, even sort of like famous actresses, I think it's maybe Keira Knightley, said she'll never read a fairy tale to her child. And there's a bit of a movement around that as well, because of sometimes a feeling maybe that the feminine is not represented in a very respectful way, and all of these sorts of things. And I feel that too, even to the point that maybe 10 years ago, certain fairy tales I was telling children in the classroom, and it felt really right to do that. 10 years later, I kind of will pick it up and go, nah, you know, I just don't want to share it with the children. I can't really say why. It's an intuitive thing. So I do believe the fairy tales move through the time, and I'm really interested as to right now, are we at a point where our fairy tales are starting to shift, which would make sense, because they have, you know, they evolve over time. All of the stories before the Grimms got them, you know, they've been on a journey themselves, and it makes me wonder. Well, there's a flip side to it, because it's like, well, we tell them these old fairy tales and we deliver all this goodness, like you were just mentioning, Bridget, you know, they get to experience cause and effect and the journey and the archetypes and all of this amazing stuff. But then there is this flip side to it. It's like, okay, but what is this saying about women in this particular story? So I'm thinking the world is going through a lot of change. It would make sense to me that our fairy tales start to change alongside with the sort of...
Yeah, with the times shifting.
With the times. That's just come through me. That's not, you know, I don't have any research to back me up with that. It's just a feeling that when I work with children, that certain stories, that especially the really dark ones, for some reason 10 years ago, the ones that had like that real dark element, I could tell the children and they sort of seemed fine with it. Now there's been a shift. I'm not sure if that's a shift in parenting or just a shift in consciousness. I'm not really sure, but the stories aren't landing the same way for me with the same age children anymore. So, and that could actually say more about me actually as well. That could actually say a lot about my journey, because when I'm telling children a story, I often pick one that I feel really connected with, because I know I'll tell it in a more authentic way, because it's meaningful to me. And then I just trust that the child, because it's all relationship, is getting what they need from the story as well. Yeah.
I've always loved the Jungian psychology perspective on story, which is all of the characters are inherently aspects of the psyche versus anything to do with gender, which for me, then I wonder about, like, I get that movement around have our identities in the way that we see men and women and others in this society changed enough that we will no longer tell the stories that maintain stereotypes. Attaches to that they're gendered, that they're individuals that exist within a community or a world outside of a single human. Whereas the understanding that I've always entered story with is that every character in that story, particularly with original old and traditional fables, is handed down as a way of self-identifying, of seeing the dark man in you and the vulnerable maiden in you and the witch and the dwarf and the, you know, like they're all aspects of psyche versus having anything to do with gender, genitals, or identity. So, I mean, how do you sit on that?
Well, I love that, and I feel the same way. And I even experimented it with that just because I wanted to see what that would feel like. So I think it was not Rapunzel, Princess and the Pea story. So I changed it a little bit. As I was telling the kids, I made like that feminine character. It wasn't about the princess coming to her with the gifts and all of that. And I changed it, and it didn't feel right to change it, to be honest. Like I changed it into a much more kind of like politically correct version. And it wasn't that fun to tell, and the kids didn't respond to it in the same way. Yeah, I think they're like, oh, if you just taken all the fun parts out, just given us, a very bland version, and it felt bland. I mean, maybe I just didn't do it service in that point, but I do agree, because I think it's like we get, in terms of perspective, we get to experience all these different parts of ourselves and parts of humanity through the story, right? Like those, I actually think that's the beautiful part of the tales, the fairy tales and the ancient myths.
You kind of know what you're personally struggling with, like whatever you kind of notice that you're closing to, or notice you have an edge around. It's like, oh, there's some shadowy parts there for me, and we know that as adults when we recognize what we struggle with, but children know that on an intuitive level, like that they're those disintegrated pieces, or those parts of them they haven't met yet, or those parts of them that feel scary. And you and I were chatting before this about you've had parents come to you asking for conscious stories, which sounds a little bit like what you've done, right? You've kind of like diluted aspects of it down to be more politically correct or palatable to diversity. But in doing that, have we become too conscious that then the true essence of the story isn't landing and actually meeting the outcome that it's designed to meet, which is actually a meeting of the self and all aspects of the self that are represented in story?
I so agree with that, just from the experience and the experimentation I've done. And I think it's like what I said before about the morals, that the intention shifts. So when you've changed a story to be conscious or politically correct, the intention of what the story is for has changed. You're not trusting the story anymore. You're actually kind of almost fear-based, going, actually, I'm going to put all these parameters around the story to make it feel a bit more comfortable, because I'm a bit uncomfortable with some of these aspects. And I think we can't just keep avoiding discomfort, especially in that landscape. It was actually quite a safe place to experience discomfort and fear in the land of story, So it's like if we start taking it away from that area, I think the kids just won't listen because they're pretty honest. But what I try to say to people, instead of looking for conscious stories or conscious fairy tales, I mean, the story is to me like a being almost, it's something that's alive. It's I think when we start to want to make it conscious or politically correct, we're almost making it like owned by the human, we're trying to own the story. It's actually, it's not ours to own. Like, that's what I feel. And when we try to do that to something, when we try to possess it and change it, it's losing all of its magic. And so my advice normally to parents is, instead of trying to find these conscious stories, it's much easier to apply a conscious awareness to the stories. So Enid Blyton, for instance, there's a lot of stuff in that when you're reading it to kids, it's like, we just wouldn't say that to children now. Some of the stuff I read it and I go, oh, wow. But I loved those stories when I was a kid, for the magic and the connection to nature, the imagination, the creativity. And I'm kind of like, do I want to lose all of that just to make it this kind of like, more comfortable reading? Or do I want to use it as a kind of another area of growth with the kids and go, wow, they used to say that to kids, they used to do that. That's what kids' lives were like. I don't think we can just pretend none of that happened, but it's like, take the kids on the journey of that as well and go, look how much has shifted. Look how much parenting's evolved since then. Look how much the role of the child has changed since then. So there's just teaching and learning moments in everything. But I think if we try to like package it all neatly and take away the uncomfortable parts, we lose any of that learning potential.
What does it mean for a story to come through you?
I say that a lot. For me, I guess the simplest way of explaining that is about relationship again. So it's about connection and relationship, and letting the story become like a seed, I guess, inside of me. I think that's what I'm meaning. And then the seed just sits there for a while. So the story sits there, and there's probably many, many little story seeds inside of me. And over my life, it just little bits of growth come through that particular story. And so I almost feel like I've loaded my system with stories, and then I just like have all these little relationships inside of me with the story. And when I need them, I can draw upon them. And sometimes they almost help me when I don't know it. It's like they're in charge running the show. And as an example, Snow White story, as a teenager, I was so anti the Snow White story. And just because I thought that's what I should be. And when I remember singing that song, One Day My Prince Will Come, and I was like, I think I said something like, get a life. And I got like, my mum and my aunties were there, and they almost like applauded me for that kind of like
feminist stance,
that stance. And then I actually had a little bit of a moment, just maybe a year or two ago, where I was talking to another storyteller who's in the States, who is amazing, and she just flipped the whole Snow White story for me and just put a completely different spin on it. And me even just going back and going, well, what did that mean for me to kind of put that lens on that Snow White character way back then, and some of my own relationship with the feminine and being vulnerable. I mean, never ending sort of growth. And so that's what I mean about the story just sort of sits inside waiting to like activate when you need it.
I love that so much.
Yeah.
It's funny to mention Snow White, actually, because that was the story I told both my girls on the way to school this morning. So Lola, who's my third, I remember being pregnant with her and obsessed with Snow White. And I was convinced that I would have this child with raven dark hair and snow white skin and, lips red as blood.
Yeah.
And of course, that's who I have. That's who Lola is. And she is every part feminine unconscious, which is what that story is about. Like, she's like so feminine. It's like really hard for me. So she's all of it. She's Snow White all wrapped in. Anyway, so I have told that story. That's been one of the stories that I have a seed for in my body also. And I have told it to her over and over and over in her whole life. And so this morning we were driving in the car. She says, Mum, what's the story of Snow White again? And so I thought I could just go blah, 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 or I could feel the story and tell the moments that I remember. It doesn't matter if I have it lyrically correct. It doesn't matter if it's like chapter by chapter. Just here's what I remember of the story. Here's what today I'm finding powerful of the story. And I actually told her the Disney version at the same time as the original version. And we got to the end of that and she went, wow, I've never heard that story before. And I was like, yeah, pretty sure you have. But I'm listening to you now going, that's the beauty of it though, right? Because the way you tell the same story will always be different. And that's the magic.
That's the magic. And literally what you just said, that's letting that story move through you. And, when we're thinking of these stories as parenting tools or support, I think that's, she'll remember that. So this is that relationship. You've got a relationship with Snow White from if you were telling her that that story was going through your head while you're pregnant. And then every time you tell the story, like it's such a powerful connection between mother and daughter as well. And it can be utilized in that, we're just driving to school or doing this, it can be utilized in such everyday moments as well. That
Let's talk about that. Let's talk about how story can influence how you parent.
Yeah.
It's too big, isn't it? Break it down for me, Bridgie. What's a better question?
Where do we go?
So the first thing that comes to mind, I guess, and that's always a decent place to start, is that's one thing that I've always managed to be able to give my boys is story. So even, you know, when we've had a like really bad day and I've just felt like I've completely, you know, made all, you know, one of those mistake days when it's just like everything's scratchy and weird and you're just kind of not connecting. If I can end the day with them with a story, that was one little thing that I thought, I can do this. Like I can give them this. I can give them my presence. I can give them a little, you know, a chance for our imaginative worlds to connect, which I feel is really important and powerful. And it's and even use the story to kind of reflect on that crappy day, if that makes sense. And the story can, and what I mean by story in that sense is not telling a fairy tale, it literally reflecting on your day together as characters. You know, you become characters, your own little story. And it's just, to me, can offer acknowledgement. It can acknowledge feelings that came up in the day. It can celebrate things if there were kind of moments that need to be celebrated, and it can do it through like a character. It doesn't have to be yourself, and so it's just got that nice little bit of distance where it's not too personal. I know if I sit down with my boys and sort of say, oh, you want to talk about that thing that happened today that, you know, that wasn't very nice, they mostly will say, no, I don't want to talk about it. You tell them a story, it's just creating a bit of distance so you can you know, so then my boys are here and I'm here, and the story is almost like becomes a bridge between us, I guess. It takes some of that pressure off.
And the telling, the like boom, boom, boom. Yeah.
Telling and that kind of like moralizing thing again. It's just sort of, it's done in such a subtle way. It's an energy thing, I think, that can be utilized. And once you start to get into the practice of doing it, it's not hard. Like I think people think, oh, how do you remember all the fairy tales and how do you remember all the myths? And I do that because that's what I use in my teaching practice, and that's what I love to do in my spare time. In my spare time, I'm looking up stories and reading books about stories. So you don't have to do that. It's just about getting into the practice of telling stories.
You don't have to do that, but gee, it helps you form a relationship with the story, which is what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Because by the time you've researched a story, and I know I learned from you because I've done your story weaving course and it was just like pure magic. I just loved it. And I really sunk into what it is to not just retell something you've heard in your childhood, but instead to go beyond. What is its story beyond? Where are its roots? How has it changed and evolved with humanity and culture and time? And by the time you've researched that, it's like having a, you know, long lost family member of some sort. You can't, like, once you've done that, you can't forget it because it's now you've rooted into, wow, it came from here and it was influenced by culture and time. And the, you know, like, it's just such an incredible and beautiful way to evolve into story. And I also love that I learned from you, and we've been talking about moving into spaces of inclusion and diversity, is telling your own culture's stories.
Yeah.
So spending the time going back into your own ancestry. Where is the richness? Where is the wisdom? Where is the stories that are in your DNA? Because you have inherently a different magic and relationship with them. So, I mean, I certainly attribute both those learnings that sunk really deep into my bones from you. And that's totally changed the way that I approach story, I think, forever.
Yeah, I'm really happy to hear that. I think there's so it's so simple as well. Like, I'm a big fan of simple tools. I don't it's simple and complex at the same time. But you know, a lot of the time when we're thinking, oh, we want our children to be connected to their family, or connected to nature, or resilient, or intuitive, you know, emotional intelligence. How do I teach them all the things? Pretty much all of those things can actually be delivered through story. So for me, it's a very much like, that's my tool, that's my thing, and that's where I stick to because I've got so much trust in it. You know, like what you're saying, Julie, about telling the stories of the family. And I've probably told Julie this, you will have heard it. I always was told a story growing up about my great-grandmother who had a dream and acted on the dream. And in the dream, something had happened to her husband. She asked him not to go to work that day, and he didn't go to work. And that day, the mine, he was a miner that he worked in, collapsed, and most of the people he worked with died. And I was just brought up with being told that story in a very casual way, like people cooking dinner and telling you that story. But when I reflect on that, and I didn't know what was happening at the time, it was just an interesting story. It's about my family. So I'm, hanging on every word. But then I realized what that story taught me was to trust in my inner landscape, trust in your dream world, trust in your intuition. Don't be afraid to say these little things of that just is an inner knowing. I also, the fact that my great-grandfather listened to his wife, there's just so many layers in it. And it's a simple story that was told in about 4 or 5 minutes. But I've learned so much through that.
I love that you've said that too, is that we inherently have story in our own lived experiences, just from our family. Even forget worrying about trying to, I don't know, some people who have the perception, well, now I've got to memorize myths and fables and legends and blah, blah, blah. Your life is rich with story. And I would say that they're some of the most, they're the stories my kids hang off, the edge of their seats for. As you're saying, even as a kid, I can remember being enthralled by this story from my own lineage. There's inherently this relationship with it, right? So instead even of looking for story outside of you, what are the ones inside of you? And how do they, because they're the lessons and the morality and the learnings that your lineage has carried down, right?
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, I won't go all about my family stories, but another one was told about my granddad, who was, he did something he wasn't supposed to do in war times. I think he went against an order to do something that he didn't agree with. That was, I think it was pretty racist towards someone else in the, whatever, I don't know the army language, the group of soldiers he was in. And he went against the sergeant's orders, and then was put and put in solitary confinement for 30 days as punishment for going against whatever orders this was. And, that story again, it wasn't told to me with an intention of much. It was just told to me as something that happened. But I draw upon that story now when I need strength, or when I need to be able to follow my own inner justice and know that I might get punished for it at the end, but I can deal with the punishment because it's literally in my bloodline to do so. And that would be the same as, it's not because I'm so special that any of us that are alive today, it's because of great acts.
Those stories and that courage.
Yeah. And so it's a much easier way than someone sitting down and telling a child, trying so badly to teach them inner strengths, where
because inner strength isn't inherent. Inner strength has to be inherent in your lineage, because you couldn't be here if it wasn't.
Yeah.
So what about if we find a way to draw powerfully on that instead of look for, the right way to consciously teach our child that?
Yeah, because it's almost the opposite, isn't it, of the conscious? It's actually allowing stuff to happen that's beyond our human control. I think it's that thinking that we can control everything, and if we do it in the right way, then we'll get the right results. Whereas sometimes you just have to trust. Trust the story, I guess, for want of a better word, and trust the reason that you're even existing here is because of all of these many, 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 many stories that happen to other individuals, for better and worse. There would be some terrible traumatic stories in there as well, and stories of pain. And it's not just the happy stories that make us who we are. And when you realize you're carrying that, I feel like that's very empowering, and small children will often respond to that really well. They love to hear story, and that's interesting in itself. Why are they so interested in that? Why do you start telling them a story about a great grandparent they've never met? And why are they interested? But they are. They really are. You just tell them something in that story form. I mean, groups of children that I teach, if I tell them something that happened on the weekend, in that form of narrative, they hang on every word. And it's not because I have such interesting weekends. It's because of the narrative. And, you know, they're wired to listen to that and connect to that. So I think, well, that's something we need to kind of like utilize and draw upon, because it's easy as well.
You know what else I wonder about is that exchange of medicine that goes both ways, in terms of you're telling the story and whoever's listening is receiving medicine. But I wonder what your thoughts are on, at the same time as you're telling the story, that medicine is also being received or deepened in you.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And I think that's why often I choose a story that has meaning to me. So I kind of do it opposite. I don't go away and look for, you know, the kids are going through whatever, maybe they're playing some game that, like, you know, we want to kind of rein in. I need to find a story for that. I don't do it like that. I go, what story is important to me right now? What story am I working on? What would be the most meaningful thing to share with them? And I will share that. And most of the time it fits whatever it is that their kids are needing as well. And I know that sounds a little kind of lofty, I guess, but it really does happen like that, because they're the themes that humans go through are the same. You know, it's like the same sorts of things. It just shows up or expresses itself in different ways.
So true.
But, you know, like it's not like
as you said, I'm thinking about, like, because at the moment I'm wanting to look for stories to support my daughter for transitions, right? Like, so leaving the relative safety and comfort and predictability of home in her life for the last 5 years, which has been very child-led, and moving into more of an institutionalized learning environment. And I can, and potentially it's going to challenge her values. And then I'm thinking, as you're saying that, gosh, like, I'm really having to traverse and shift into things that are challenging my values. And so that's really alive in me right now.
Yeah. So symbiotic, is it? It's just
yeah.
It's all perfect as well. And you will deliver that. So again, the intention or the energy behind you delivering a story to her that's meaningful to you will actually impact and land in a much more powerful way than you're looking for a story for her. You know,
the transmission then, right?
Yeah, because you'll be so deeply connected to it that it will just come through on a different level. And I mean, I worked with a group of girls, older girls, 10 to 12-year-olds last year, and we did the story of the Baba Yaga all year. So Vasilisa and little doll.
I love the Baba Yaga.
Yeah.
Too. And the story, I kept telling them the story, and we did it for weeks and weeks and weeks on end. But I chose that one for me, you know, I chose it for me. But then to see how it wove through the girls as well in ways that I would never have imagined. So again, that's that relationship. So the girls' response to the story helped me with whatever I was going through, and my response to the story would help the girls. So it's like a beautiful relationship. Yeah, an exchange.
And would you say that with like almost any story, you can deliver it, like whether the child's 10 or 5, or do you change aspects of it for what you think is age appropriate?
Yeah, I change aspects of it. I once heard, I can't say who I heard this from, but I was given the advice to treat the, like, sort of almost create stepping stones in the story. And I mean, that by doing that, you actually create this transition rite of passage type story that you're talking about anyway, Bridget. So say you start telling a story to a 2 or 3-year-old, and it's just the simple version of it. And then when they're 4, they get a little bit more. And when they're 5, they get a little bit more. And so the story itself is a transition and a rite of passage as well, because it's like, well, when you're ready for the next part of the story, we can give that to you. And it's a little bit tricky to tell people how to do that. But again, if you've got a connection to a story and a deep relationship with it, it's intuitive. Like, it'll just become an intuitive practice over time. You just know what to say to this particular child, because you know what one 6-year-old's ready for, another 4-year, like it depends on the individual. You know, I know,
Just interrupting our podcast, Developing Your Inner Storyteller, to let your wisdom guide your child, to let you know what we've got going on. So if you are somebody who is also going through transitions like I am, perhaps it's starting kinder or starting school, I really invite you to go onto my website, bridgetwood.life/transitions, to get your free guide, 10 Ways to Thrive Through Transitions. It'll be a beautiful, power-packed set of tools and perspective shifts to help you feel nourished and connected during times of shifting and changing with our children. And to connect with everything that Julie's got going on, head over to julietenner.love. It's interesting. I've got two questions. So on that note of like different ages, because at the moment with our family, we're really into the Harry Potter series. So largely because I'm reading it to my 8-year-old, but my 5-year-old is really into it too, but she'll come in and out of it and obviously won't pick up all aspects of it. But then as I'm telling it, there's aspects that I'm challenged by, like in terms of like political correctness and inclusivity and diversity, right? So there's parts of me that like will read it, like particularly the characterization of, you're familiar with the Harry Potter series? Yeah. So like Dudley, like in that family, and how much there's like fat shaming in the story, and like how much do we recognize that there's going to be a lot of focus on physical attributes to build characters, and then how much do we also use that as like a learning opportunity with our children to help them understand how people might feel when we talk about people like that, like, you know, the nuance as we tell stories and what's for us and what's actually for the child in a story like that. Like, what would you sort of say to manage that?
There's many, like, I guess, levels to it. I guess first of all, with not specifically Harry Potter, but just in general, when those things turn up, that like the body shaming, that sort of thing. I think stories and narrative just reflect the world we're in. So until we're a world that doesn't have any body shaming in it, it's going to turn up in our stories and our world, right? It's
such an interesting way of looking at it. How fascinating. Just as a way of discussing culture and socialization.
Yeah.
And as Tara would say, those wheels of like actually being able to see the wheels of socialization as opposed to trying to edit them out so our kids don't notice them.
Isn't
that interesting?
Well, I even with that story, because I was reading it going, and I was like bristling a bit, and I was thinking, if this, because it was written 25 years ago, or maybe more, would it be written in the same way? I don't know that it would be.
Yeah, exactly. And things have changed a lot, you know, since the 90s or whatever. Even if I listen to music, that I was listening to in the 90s, and I am, because one of my sons has suddenly really got into that sort of 90s hip hop, and I'm listening to it going, oh my God. But then I listened to it at the same, age, and it doesn't, I don't know if that's right or wrong, because when I hear my son, you know, it's uncomfortable. I don't like hearing it. But I think that's one thing of, like, we can't sort of pretend these things don't exist in the world by cutting them out of our arts, because
then it's cancel culture, right? Like that is the problem. Do we sanitize everything so much because we don't want to offend anybody that we then edit out our own ability to be with discomfort and to be with self-responsibility in that discomfort, and potentially be so uncomfortable that we then reflect on our part in that and our part in perpetuating that or not perpetuating.
Yeah, because, you know, they're exaggerated characters, obviously, but elements of that exist in the world. That's why they're in the story. And then it's and even if it's not as, you know, maybe if she'd written it now, she wouldn't have written those things. But it doesn't mean it's gone from our world yet. It just means we've learned a little bit more of, actually, don't say that. You don't say that out loud. But it's clearly, it happens in the world. We know it's still happening. So, you know, I think over time these things change and filter out and evolve. But evolution doesn't just happen like that. It's like the stepping stones. And then the other flip side, I think it's just become talking points then. So it's like, depending on the age of the child, you would say, like I said with Enid Blyton, oh, isn't it interesting what she said? You know, what do you think about that? What do you think the place is? So it's a talking point. But then again, a stepping stone for the child, because maybe a 5-year-old isn't ready to have that kind of complex conversation, but a teenager can. The advice I was given with Harry Potter a long time ago, and I'm still, you know, I don't know, again, like right or wrong, was that the books should be that rite of passage like Harry himself. So if you start a child reading them at 11, so the first book, I think Harry's 11, and it's sort of there's this it's appropriate for an 11-year-old, and then a 12-year-old, and then because he grows obviously a year in each of the books, and by the time he gets to 16, that's why the books are a lot darker and a lot more is going on, because the character has evolved. And it was one of those really interesting times where the readers could evolve alongside with the character.
It's pretty really fascinating.
It's super interesting. Yeah, but I know a lot of younger kids now reading Harry Potter. I mean, I read Harry Potter when I was like late teens, 20s, I think, early 20s. But my younger cousin literally was the age, he was 11 when the first one came out, and he grew with Harry Potter, and I was thought, oh, that's fascinating. Yeah. They're quite dark, those books.
They are, yeah, they definitely get darker.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
What have been some of your favourite stories, Gill? What are your, like, you know, they are the stories that I just kind of keep in my heart?
Like fairy tales or book, just anything kind of thing?
Anything, yeah.
It's definitely, it would have changed over time. And I memean, I was a massive reader as a kid. Like I read and my mom used to take books off me to send me outside. So I think those sorts of Enid Blyton, anything fantasy was really my thing, I guess, which is probably why I really got into the Harry Potter stuff as even like someone a bit older. Anything that had any magical elements to it. I'm pretty sure my nature connection, the way I can find peace in nature is, I think, highly connected to the obsession with Enid Blyton books, because I remember it now when the kids used to jump over the ditch into the enchanted wood and they would feel the energy shift and they would feel the magic. I knew that feeling so well that I think it's so deeply ingrained that now I just have to go out into nature by myself and I feel like I'm in one.
That's freaking genius, isn't it?
Those books. So it's something, my inner world's really strong, I think, because of those books. So Roald Dahl, I mean, so many books, and stories. And then fairy tales are just now in the last 4 or 5 years, I'm rebuilding my relationship with fairy tales, because I did have like a pretty anti princess idea as a kid, you know, not as a kid, as a probably teenager.
Yeah.
So I'm just rediscovering those fairy tales and realizing that there's some amazing, I mean, even Bible, I even read the Bible as a kid. Like I just love stories so much, because the world religions are stories, you know, education stories are
creation stories and religious stories are among the most fascinating and actually most laden with metaphor.
Yeah.
And yet I think the problem is that, you know, well, I think there's lots of problems that I probably don't need to go into in a public podcast. But what I want to say is I actually think there's an incredible value in revisiting those stories. So I didn't grow up Catholic, but my kids are. And so I've bought all sorts of biblical stories from, and Bridget, you know, because you were Catholic, what is the early Testament? And there's like 3 of them.
Yeah, the Old Testament and the New Testament.
Yes. Yeah. And so they had these beautiful child versions. They've got Lego versions. And so, yeah. And so I've sat down and really read those stories with my kids. And, you know, still one of my son's favorites is the Prince of Egypt, and that whole, like, particularly in the Old Testament, they are among the most incredible metaphorical stories that you will ever read. Like, they're just wonderful. So I do think it's worth visiting all cultures' origin stories and how they tell their own versions of spirituality.
Yeah, I agree. And it's almost there's something quite beautiful when you start to see common themes or ideas even pop up, you know, through the different cultural creation myths, and you think, wow, that's amazing that, you know, they're in Asia, they had such a similar story to, you know, somewhere so far away, and it just brings that unity and
like
realizing, you know, it's something that's nice. I like that idea. Yeah.
Are there any ways that you would like to share that you intentionally use story to help your kids transition through tricky spots?
Yeah, I think in addition to, you know, what I was saying before, is I like to use story itself as a transitional tool. So I feel like that's there anyway, giving them little experiences of transition, even when they're not in a transition moment. You know, I think sometimes when we wait to the transition moment, it's not too late. It's never going to be too late, but we can help ourselves out, you know, help by starting those stories way back. And then it's hard for me to answer that, because I see that transition and rite of passage in nearly every single story I ever tell. Like, I feel like that's a very common theme throughout all stories.
It's part of the, you know, the architecture of a story, isn't it? It's that traversing of challenge.
Yeah. And so I honestly would choose anyone that kind of resonated with me. My boys have all loved the Three Billy Goats Gruff. And, you know, they're a family of 3 brothers as well. But interesting, the older two like that even before the youngest was born. And to me, that's the transition to, you know, just getting over the bridge with the troll underneath. And, like, you know, like that's the
My 5-year-old's scared of that. It's funny, she's scared of that, but she loves Harry Potter. Like, you know, and as I'm hearing you say about how dark Harry Potter is, I'm like, gosh, it's probably a little bit too grown up. But yet she'll be scared of she's scared of the Billy Goat's Gruff, like that story being told, which is just so interesting how different stories land, isn't it?
Is it because of that? Because of that archetype? Because it's literally speaking about the transition that she may be struggling with right now, so she doesn't want to go there, versus Harry Potter doesn't necessarily speak to that.
Maybe. I think it's the characterization of the under the bridge, the person under the bridge. But yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe it is that kind of thread of what that literally represents. Across. Yeah.
It could be, because she would intuitively just know, you know, she intuitively knows what's going on for her. And if the story's got that little, it's interesting to me that there's that common theme. She doesn't like that story, and then that's what you want to work on with her.
Yeah.
Interesting.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
It's worth gently reintroducing it. Yeah.
Yeah. And if she's seen it, unless she's seen a book with I had worked with one little boy who was terrified of Three Billy Goats Gruff, but it turned out he'd read the book, and the particular illustration of the troll just terrified him, and he could not get that illustrate. So again, that's sometimes why the storytelling is a little because it allows them to create their own troll, as scary as it needs to be for that individual. I mean, I worked with one little girl, and we told that story every day, and she would just say, but the troll's really nice, right, Jill? Like, she's like, but and I would finish the story, and then she'd say, and then the troll came back, and he was actually really nice. And she just needed to add that to it for her own, you know, and she was fine me telling the story, but it was almost a thing where she had to say that at the end.
How fascinating. This whole thing is fascinating.
Yeah, it is really fascinating. The Billy Goats Gruff's been a funny one in our house, just because, you know, the 3 boys, they've all loved it, been obsessed with it. To the point my youngest, he thinks he is the youngest, the smallest Billy Goat that goes along the, you know, and he literally, when I'm telling the story, he'll say, an Oscar for the big one, and then Hugo. He gives them the names, and I think, well, yeah, if you want to call them that, you can.
That's funny to hear that, because my kids are all obsessed with not so much Pearl yet, but the Enchanted Wood, and in fact, my kids are all that same, like, boy, girl, characters of the Enchanted Wood.
Yeah, that's amazing. I think they're pretty. They know what they're doing. Kids know how story works. They're not, you know, they're not sort of been through the kind of life and conditioning we have to go, that's just imagination, it doesn't matter, that's just a story, it's not important. They're not there, so they just have the trust with it, and it's just, the story is beautiful for them because it is, you know, there's not an agenda, it's just the story itself is enough. And I think that is a story. I think that's something really key to get through to any teachers I work with, but also parents. It's like, if you can forget about the end game, if you can forget about your outcome or an agenda and just enjoy the story will do much more sort of healing than if you're kind of like really want them to hear the story and then become okay with transition. You know, it's taking away that agenda and outcome seems to be necessary for the story to really take the journey it needs to take.
For it to be medicine, because if you have like an outcome of how you think it needs to be, it's like they sense, kids are so, they sense that if you've got, you know.
Oh yeah. Yeah. They know well.
Before we wrap up, I'm just interested in what you would say to parents who are just wanting to know how to trust themselves more, to start bringing more of their own storytelling into how they parent and bring connection. What I loved about hearing you say before was, even if I've had a super rough day, I always knew I could find one story that spoke to my heart and share that with my kids at the end of the day. Or I could tell the story of our day and we would still find a sense of regulation and connection to end that day. So what would you say to parents who are wanting to trust themselves more to do that?
I think sort of being really keeping things simple for yourself and starting with a story that you already know so well and love so well that you could tell, whether that's a simple nursery rhyme, a fairy tale, whether it's a family story. There's so many different types of stories. Just starting with that one that you can tell purely from the heart, I guess. You don't have to think about it. I think the difficulty is when we add the layers to it of, like I just said, telling a story to produce a certain outcome. It's like, just drop all of that and instead just start with one story that really deeply resonates and explore that with the child and just see where it goes. And if, you know, you want to start super simply, just do start every single day where you tell a story that's a reflection of the day, you know, and it doesn't have to be a complex story at all. Like, it can literally be, you know, we got up and we went to school. Like, it doesn't have to be, you know, anything exciting with like great big characters coming in. And another probably even simpler idea, I guess, I just thought of is telling the child a story about themselves from a younger time. So because we can do that as parents and we like to tell our stories of our children. So, I mean, my eldest loves to hear stories about himself from, you know, when he was 2 or 3, you know, that time they don't remember anymore. And it can be as simple as, you know, you loved getting up to get in the fridge and get something out of it, you know, whatever their favorite toy they had as a 2-year-old, or special, you know, the way they use language as a 2-year-old. I think that's a really nice starting point, because it allows you to kind of connect to this tool of storytelling in a way that's probably going to come quite naturally to you. And the child's getting a lot of goodness out of that as well, because it's about self-connection and self-identity. And they say that there's that healing quality of hearing your own story being told. And I mean, you could get into it quite deeply, but it's a theme in some of the, like, I think even some of the Greek myths. I can't remember the character's not coming to my head, but when he went on a journey and he ended up somewhere and he was told, I can't remember the character, but he was told a story about his journey, but the storyteller didn't know it was him when he heard his own story told through the sort of words of a stranger, he sort of broke down in tears. And it was kind of a pivotal point in the story where the hero kind of like changed the whatever direction of his story. And it's the same kind of aspect. I think we can really gift our children a lot by telling them their own story. So, and I think that's an easy place for parents to start as well.
Yeah, it's a beautiful reminder of all the ways in which you actually are already a storyteller, because it can be really easy to go, oh gosh, I'm not a great storyteller. Yeah. Like, I tell myself that for sure, but I can see how, I tell stories all the time to my children.
I think we're all storytellers. We're not necessarily all entertainers. And I think storytelling's got a like confused with being an entertainer. And I mean, that was my biggest issue when I was a new teacher and I was given this practice of storytelling by my mentor. I remember, but I can't do that. Like, I cannot do, even though I love story and I had such a strong relationship with story, to actually tell, like, have an audience. All of the tricks in my head that played were around the belief system that if you're not an entertainer, I'm not an extrovert, I'm not an entertainer, I'm not like going to be great at doing character voices, and it's not going to have all the bells and whistles. So actually, you know, doing a little bit of thought into actually separating those, like, storytelling is not about entertaining. It's really different, and we're all storytellers. I think got born that way.
I love that so much. Is there anything that you want to ask Bridget before we move into our quick fire questions?
No, I'm really happy to move into the questions now. Thank you, Jill.
Amazing. Are you ready, Jill?
I think I've forgotten the questions. I know you.
And you're perfectly ready.
Yeah.
So the question we always start with is there a time in your life that you'd be willing to share where you have experienced a challenge, a struggle, a pain, or a wound that you've gone on your own journey of healing or recovery or self-excavation or finding, you know, the gold from, to end up the other side of that wounded place with some pretty incredible wisdom? So is there a story from your past that you would feel comfortable in sharing with us in our community about what wisdom you have mined, so we may all benefit from your lived experience?
Yeah, that's an amazing question, isn't it? And it's so relevant to what we're talking about today. Definitely for me, the first thing would be the births of my second and third boys. I mean, they were all life-changing, right, when we give birth. But my first birth was quite textbook, you know, drug-free. It was like my birth plan. It was all what I envisioned the birth would be. Quite an empowering experience, really. And I had those expectations for my second and third. And then both my second and third just had these sort of freak things come. I had placenta previa with my second son. And ended up in an emergency cesarean and all of these things. But it was 7 weeks of bed rest that I had to go on before I was able to give birth to him, because they just wanted me to, they wanted the baby to be able to get as big as possible, I guess. But throughout those 7 weeks of bed rest, this is the biggest, there was a lot of learning in this experience. But the biggest thing, I think, was that how I utilized my spiritual tools, or, you know, yogic tools and meditation tools, because what I tried to do for those 7 weeks was control the situation through meditation techniques. And, you know, I drilled myself with affirmations, because they told me there was 1% chance that my placenta would move and I'd be able to deliver naturally. And I just hung on to that 1% and believed very much that through the power of mind and visualization and all of these things, that I could take control over the situation and shift it. And to be honest, nothing was working, and things just, you know, it had a really long to get to the details of the story, I guess. Everything went wrong. Everything kept going wrong at the last minute. So the doctors would sort of be, oh, well, now we have to do this cesarean. I'm sure it will be fine, though, you know, it should be textbook, it should be straightforward. Then they got it. Things just kept going wrong and wrong and wrong and wrong. And the whole time in my head, I hung so tightly to this affirmations, the best thing I can think of telling my body to kind of take control over the situation. And then even after he was born, he was fine. They still couldn't control, sort of bleeding in me. So for 2 or 3 days afterwards, I'm in intensive care, absolutely exhausted, still using my mind to kind of control. And then this nurse came in at about midnight, and I said to her, I don't understand why this is happening to me. Everything's going wrong, you know, but I'm doing all the things, I'm doing all the tools. And she said to me, that thing, it's like a common, she said, oh, God only gives us what we can handle. I don't know if you know that, you know, that's a common phrase. And it actually made me really angry. And I finally got really upset. And I said to her, then this is it. I can't actually handle anymore. And I finally completely just gave up on fighting this kind of battle. And I swear 2 or 3 hours later, the doctors came in and they said, oh, everything's resolved itself, and I know that sounds like a ridiculous story, but it's the reason that's such a big experience for me is because of the humility and the humbling and the bigger picture of going, oh, just because you do a bit of yoga and meditation doesn't mean you get to like call all the shots. There's much more going on here than just you. So it was a very kind of like good, humbling, vulnerable lesson, and it's really flipped how I approach most things in life, I think, from a greater place of trust, but also knowing when like this isn't up to me anymore, when to let go of those rein control that I think are just an illusion anyway.
It's truly surrender though, isn't it? Like the moment you surrendered.
Yeah, it was surrender, but realizing that the textbook version of surrender is nothing like when life brings us surrender, and you don't always get to call when those lessons come to you.
Yeah, this is one of the points that annoys me the most about spiritual communities, especially the tantric ones, is we don't actually understand what it means to surrender. If we really knew what that was on a devotional level, we wouldn't be using it in pop culture.
I could not agree more, because I remember back then I understood the concept of surrender, but I also Googled how to surrender, which I'm really embarrassed about.
What did Google tell you?
I remember, but obviously didn't give me any wisdom, because nothing worked.
Still holding on.
Yeah, I was still holding on, still trying to control surrender. And like I said, it was just like life kind of was like, just stop it. And this nurse who I've never met, and in my life again, and she just was in my life for probably no more than 5 minutes, but had these words to kind of almost break me, but in a good way. And so it was just like going, I don't get to decide when surrender happens, So yeah, that it's got to be that moment, I think.
Thank you. That was profound and beautiful.
Oh. The next question is books. What is the most inspiring book that you recommend to others that's really moved you?
So probably fiction. I'm a big fan of I don't normally recommend parenting books, but Robin Grill's book, Parenting for a Peaceful World. I've just found that so inspiring, and again, a little bit of humility in that of just let's look at the big picture of some of how things happen and letting go of some of the control. I love his work. So I find his work really inspiring on that kind of non-fiction level. And then The Alchemist.
Oh yeah, great book.
Yeah, that's probably one that just throughout my life I've read sort of periodically. It kind of pops back up and I read it again. There was another one I was going to suggest. I think then, and The Element by Ken Robinson. That's a book that is really meaningful to me as well. So, yeah.
Oh, thank you. Great mix. If you could have a billboard on any highway, what would it say?
As soon as I saw this question and thought of it, like I'd like to go with the first thing that comes up, and it probably doesn't make any sense, but for me, something that I would like to see when I was driving, and that I would like the opportunity to ponder on, is if it just says the words that came to me were just where have you been, where are you going? And I know that sounds a bit random for a billboard, but I like being given invitations to reflect, so it's just stop and where have you gone, where have you been, and where are you going? It would definitely be around that for me, because I think reflection is like our biggest, I think, again, I'm a big fan of all the kind of subtle, invisible tools in life, like reflection, story, the things that are hard to measure. I think that message is meaningful to me.
I love that, because even where have you gone, it's just an invitation into telling your own story or building your own narrative, isn't it?
Yeah, I didn't think of that's true.
Oh, thank you so much, Gill.
We would love for you to share how we find you, connect with you, and what are ways that we can jump into your work in the world.
Thank you. So I work under the name Born Wise. I offer programs for children, but also courses and consults for families, via www.bornwise.com.au. And also I've just recently done a collaboration with a local yoga teacher that I'm really proud of, called the Light Weavers, and that is drawing upon the power of story and in guided meditations for kids. And there's an inner world curriculum attached to that, which it's focusing on all those things that I said that are important to me, the invisible stuff that is not something that we put a lot of emphasis on, but it's how families can use a few different practices and creative practices to build like an inner landscape, I guess, for the whole family. So it's for all ages.
Sounds amazing. I'm going to check that out. Thank you.
So for any of our listeners wondering, we'll have all of those links in the show notes so you can scroll on down there and find them too.
Remember to nourish the woman to rock the family.
And we'll see you next week when we continue to peel back the layers on your mothering journey.
Thank you so much for listening. We literally couldn't do this without you. Please share this podcast with anyone you think it would be medicine for.
If you desire to integrate your learnings practically and supportively into your life, then head on over to bridgetwood.life or julietenner.love to go deeper.
And if you feel like giving back a little to this free content, please rate us on iTunes or Facebook, all of which helps the podcast reach more mamas who need this type of tonic for the soul.
This has been a production of TheWellnessCouch.com. Check us out on Facebook and join in the conversation on Facebook.com/TheWellnessCouch. Subscribe to each show on iTunes and check us out on Twitter. The Wellness Couch, streaming wellness into your lives.
Whilst the Wellness Couch presenter endeavor to provide accurate and helpful information to their listeners, these podcasts cannot take into account individual circumstances and are not intended to be a substitute for health and medical advice from a qualified health professional. You should always seek the advice of a qualified health professional before acting on any of the information provided by any of the Wellness Couch podcasts.